Colonel Sanders is the craziest man in the history of fast food, and he's also a failure. By the end of his life, Sanders had grown to hate KFC and would allegedly make surprise visits to restaurants. If he disliked the food, he'd condemn it as slop and throw it on the floor of the restaurant in disgust. Franchisees and executives knew him for what The New Yorker described as the force and variety of his swearing. But before he started his chicken empire, Sanders failed miserably at many different jobs and business ventures, some of which included working as a streetcar conductor, a tire salesman, and a lawyer. And he also owned at least two businesses, a ferry boat company and a lamp company. And somehow he did all of this before he ever sold a piece of fried chicken. At age 65, after selling off his only restaurant at a loss, Sanders felt ruined. He had just his savings and a meager $105 a month he was receiving from Social Security. However, instead of calling it quits and throwing in the towel, the Colonel sat down, locked in, and came up with a plan that would make him a millionaire, and gave the world what we now know as KFC. How did he do it? Colonel Harlan David Sanders was born on September 9, 1890, in Henryville, Indiana. For the first 5 years of his life, he lived a normal childhood with his father, mother, and two younger siblings. But at 6 years old, everything changed after his father passed away. His mother had to go get a job at a tomato cannery and no longer had time to look after the children. So Sanders' job became taking care of his younger brother and sister. While his mother was away working for days at a time, Sanders cooked meat and vegetables for his younger siblings. In 1902, when Sanders was just 12 years old, he and his family moved to Greenwood, Indiana, after his mother married a man named William Broadus. However, William disliked the idea of stepchildren, and this resulted in a rocky relationship between he and Sanders. After dropping out of 7th grade, stating that algebra was what drove him off, Sanders left home at age 13 to escape his stepfather, and for a short time he got a job painting horse carriages in Indianapolis. In 1906, when Sanders was just 16 years old, he moved to New Albany, Indiana, where his uncle got him a job as a streetcar conductor. Later that year, after falsifying his birth date, Sanders enlisted in the Army, which oddly enough is not how he earned the title colonel, because he was honorably discharged from the Army after only 4 months of service. After his honorable discharge, Sanders found work as a steam engine stoker. He shoveled coal for about 3 years until his boss fired him for insubordination. At this point, Sanders realized he had a hard time taking orders from anyone, so he figured he'd try out a new path. He began studying law through a correspondence school called LaSalle Extension University to become a lawyer. And after he became a lawyer, Sanders moved to Little Rock, Arkansas for work. But even though he did well in this job, this one also didn't last long. After only 3 years of practicing law, Sanders made a massive blunder. One day, he absolutely snapped and got into a vicious fight with one of his own clients during court. This mistake cost him his career and reputation as a lawyer. Depressed and defeated, Sanders made his way back home to live with his mother. Once he got back home, Sanders got a job selling life insurance. Like many of his other jobs, after a short time, Sanders got fired for, shockingly, insubordination. He then got another job selling insurance, which ended the exact same way. This man was seemingly incapable of holding down any job. At age 30, after failing at every job he tried, Sanders decided to become his own boss and started a ferry boat company. He operated this business successfully for a couple of years, but overall Sanders was unsatisfied with this line of work and decided it was time to move on and press his luck. So he took his shares from the ferry boat company, cashed them in, and used the money to start a business that manufactured acetylene lamps. And this business actually did well for a number of years. But ultimately, like Sanders' other jobs and ventures, his lamp business eventually failed as well. It went under quickly after a company called Delco invented a better lamp, an electric lamp. And once again, Sanders had no job and no way to make money. Even worse, his little lamp venture cost him his life savings. From here, Sanders desired nothing other than a fresh start. So he decided to move to Winchester, Kentucky, and found work as a tire salesman for the Michelin Tire Company. Either by chance or by divine intervention, he ran into the general manager of an oil company. This man asked Sanders a question he could only say yes to. He asked if he'd be interested in running a gas station in Nicholasville, Kentucky. Sanders, less than thrilled about his work as a tire salesman, jumped at the opportunity and ran the business for 6 years, from 1924 to 1930, until it closed due to the effects of the Great Depression. Once the gas station closed, he was once again out of work and had no idea what to do. At age 40, he had no job and no job prospects. Understandably, he felt it was all over. However, that same year, he got his big break. Out of the blue, the Shell Oil Company reached out and offered Sanders a gas station in North Corbin, Kentucky, rent-free. All he had to do was pay them a percentage of monthly sales. And Sanders said, "Give me that gas station," or something to that effect. The gas station sat on a busy highway, and many customers came looking to fill up their cars and their stomachs. This gave Sanders an idea. One day, he started cooking his own food and selling it to hungry travelers. Nothing official, just selling food whenever he could. At first, he sold a meal here and there, but after a while, customers came in begging for some of his trademark dishes, such as pan-fried chicken, ham, okra, green beans, and buttermilk biscuits. His food grew in popularity to the point where it no longer made sense to sell gasoline, so he ripped out the pumps to make space for parking and converted the gas station into a full restaurant. From here, Sanders' life started looking up. In 1935, Kentucky Governor Ruby Laffoon commissioned Sanders as a Kentucky colonel, making him the Colonel Sanders we know today. And in 1939, Sanders bought a motel in Asheville, North Carolina. But unfortunately, disaster struck later that year when his North Corbin restaurant caught fire and burnt to the ground. Sanders, now in a better place in life, took this misfortune in stride and rebuilt it bigger and better as a motel with a 140-seat restaurant. The following year, in 1940, Sanders put the finishing touches on his secret recipe for frying chicken in a pressure cooker. But he did this at the worst possible time. As the US entered World War II, all forms of tourism temporarily died out, and Sanders had to close his Asheville motel in 1942. His North Corbin restaurant, however, remained highly successful, and Sanders naively assumed this would be the case forever. He thought he was set for life. But this was far from the truth. In front of his restaurant was a highway junction, and this junction encouraged a heavy flow of travelers ready to drop big bucks on fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Sanders got news that this junction was moving to another area of town. And to make matters worse, he heard rumors that a new highway was in the works, and this one would bypass his restaurant entirely. Finally, he decided this business had no future and decided to sell it off in 1956. Sanders himself admits he sold it at a considerable loss. Now, at age 66, he had nothing. He lost his business, had very little in savings, and his main source of income now was from Social Security, at just over $100 per month. But instead of feeling sorry for himself, he formulated a plan to get rich. He got the idea from his friend Pete Harmon, who owned a restaurant in Salt Lake City. A few years earlier, in 1952, Sanders taught Harmon his process for frying chicken. Harmon then began serving the chicken in his restaurant, and over the years his business ballooned in size, all of which Harmon attributed to the delicious fried chicken Sanders taught him to make. From here, he decided to jump in with both feet into the franchising business. At nearly 70 years old, he threw some pressure cookers into the back of his car, put some spices and seasonings into containers, and drove off looking for potential franchisees. He went from door to door, or more accurately, from restaurant to restaurant. Sanders often slept in the back of his car to save money, since at the time he had very little, and ate for free whenever possible. According to many sources, he received 1,009 rejections before someone took him up on his offer. He'd roll up to a restaurant he liked and would straight up ask the owner if he could cook some fried chicken for them and their employees. Even though this was an unconventional approach, eventually it worked wonders, because the 1,010th person the Colonel asked gave him a chance. This was the birth of the KFC we know today. Operations grew fast, and by 1960, Sanders had over 200 locations serving his fried chicken. He and his wife Claudia teamed up on the business together. Sanders handled the bookkeeping portion of the business, while his wife handled the packing and shipping. In 1962, he got a patent to protect his precious method of pressure frying chicken. Their success continued rapidly, and by 1963, they had over 600 locations cooking and selling their chicken. That same year, they trademarked their iconic phrase, "It's finger-lickin' good." Yearly profits before taxes reached over $300,000, and Sanders felt the business had reached a critical point. He sensed it was right on the verge of getting out of hand. He had nearly 20 employees and business was booming, but he wasn't sure he could handle much more. Now, at age 74, Sanders knew he couldn't do this forever and began worrying about the future of KFC after his death. So he did the only logical thing he could think of. He sold the business for $2 million to some businessmen from Kentucky, but Sanders still wasn't ready to let go, at least not completely. He became a salaried brand ambassador for KFC, for which he traveled over 100,000 miles every year. Over the years, he appeared in numerous TV commercials and made many public appearances. From here, however, depending on how you look at it, the life of Colonel Sanders took a sad turn. After he sold the company, KFC made changes that Sanders deemed unacceptable. They had changed all of his recipes. An executive commented on the changed gravy recipe. Let's face it, the Colonel's gravy was fantastic, but you had to be a Rhodes Scholar to cook it. Sanders no longer had control over the company, so the most he could do was complain and voice his frustrations as loudly as possible. For the remainder of his life, he was a major critic, and you could even say hater, of KFC. He'd travel to KFC restaurants around the world and would criticize the food quality. He called the gravy slop, and sometimes even got confrontational with the owners and called them a bunch of booze hounds. In 1970, in an article published by The New Yorker, Sanders stated about the gravy, "It ain't fit for my dogs." And then in 1973, he sued KFC's parent company for the use of his image. In 1975, KFC sued Sanders for libel after he called their gravy sludge with a wallpaper taste. It's safe to say Colonel Sanders really had a way with words. He'd remain critical of KFC's offerings for the rest of his life. Colonel Harlan David Sanders passed away 5 years later on December 16, 1980. When it comes to the life of Colonel Sanders, one question looms larger than others. Was he a success or was he a failure? The answer feels obvious. He created one of the largest fast food restaurants today, and he made piles of money along the way. But it's possible, and even likely, that the Colonel saw everything the opposite way, because for the last chunk of his life, he lived in disappointment, embarrassment even, at what his life's work had become. He was bitter, and he was angry. Is that success, or is that failure? Colonel Sanders says, "One has to remember that every failure can be a stepping stone to something better." Whether the Colonel considers himself a success or a failure does little to take away from his legacy. The fact remains, he created a fried chicken empire that's still thriving today, and they're still plastering his face on every restaurant. It's tough to argue that's anything but a success, even if the Colonel may think otherwise. Thank you so much for watching.